Hi, I'm Robert Wright. I run the Non-Zero Foundation, which produces The Glenn Show and all other shows on Blogging Heads TV and Meaning of Life TV. We host a variety of voices, some of them highly unorthodox, and we encourage dialogue that is sharp but civil. We think fostering constructive conversation is especially important now that America, and even the world, is looking kind of fragile. If you agree that our mission is important, I hope you'll consider helping us shoulder the cost. You can do that by becoming one of our cherished patrons at patreon.com/nonzero foundation. That's NONZEROFOUNDATION. Thanks. We need your help, and we deeply appreciate it.
Hello, Peter Arcidiacono, you're back. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Good to see you again.
This is Glenn Loury, The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, which is sponsored by the Watson Institute for Public and International Affairs at Brown University, where I'm a professor of economics at Brown. I'm with Peter Arcidiacono, who is a professor of economics at Duke. This is part two of Peter's appearance here on The Glenn Show. We recorded just last week. It was posted, a conversation about the affirmative action lawsuit that involves Students for Fair Admissions, which represents Asian students suing Harvard University for discrimination in admissions. Everybody has heard about this lawsuit. Peter served as an expert witness on behalf of the Asian students in that lawsuit, which is now on appeal, and his arguments are being heard in the appellate court even as we speak about that lawsuit. We talked about that in the last edition of The Glenn Show that Peter was a guest on, but we're back because, let me see if I can show everybody why we're back at some level. Okay, I'm gonna try to do this. I'm gonna try to share my screen so that you guys can see this political cartoon, which is now about 5 years old. But it depicts some members of the United States Supreme Court hearing oral arguments in an affirmative action case, the Fisher case out of the University of Texas, if I'm not mistaken. And Justice Scalia is shown there in Klansman's robes, as you can see. And Justice Sotomayor is commenting, I see Justice Scalia has a new robe, okay? He has a new robe, he's a Klansman. Now, why? Why is this cartoon being, Justice Thomas is shown asleep at the switch. Why is this cartoon appearing? Because the court is hearing arguments in an affirmative action case. And Justice Scalia has asked the attorneys representing the University of Texas, which is defending affirmative action, about whether or not African-American students might not be better off if they went to less demanding institutions for higher education. Now, that's a controversial issue because he's basing his question on implications of something that's called the mismatch theory, which applies in affirmative action, namely that sometimes kids who benefit from affirmative action may be mismatched, may be put at a school where they don't prosper, but if they had been at a less academically demanding environment, they might have done better. This is the theory. Not saying it's right or wrong, just saying Scalia is asking about it. The fact that he asked leads a cartoonist to depict him as a Klansman. This is the environment that we live in, the political environment where the affirmative action issue is being debated. And Peter is right on the front lines in this environment because he's a researcher whose scholarly work touches on these questions, and he tries to bring facts to bear in answering these questions, and he's sometimes catches a lot of flack for doing so. Now, I don't want to speak for him. I'm just introducing the conversation. I don't think he would portray himself as a martyr, but he does have some interesting things to say about how do you react to that cartoon, and will you try to explain to people a little bit about what the mismatch theory is all about and why it's important and what the evidence is and whatnot. Like, let's have a conversation about that.
Yeah, and I think you have to lead sort of with that we're on the same page, and that I want Black students to succeed. I want them to succeed. And I'm interested in that occurring. I think a lot of people perceive this stuff as it's all a front. You know, what you're really interested in doing is you're trying to hold Black people down. And, you know, I reject that. I think we mentioned a little bit that my faith is important to me, and that plays a role here. That I know I mess up all the time, and we're all in the same boat. Every person has dignity, period, and I want that affirmed. And I think that's something I've been thinking quite a bit about, is that for a long time that's not how Blacks were treated. And so why should you believe me now? But I want to lay that out there, that I'm interested in the success of all groups. So when I'm talking about the mismatch hypothesis, I want to evaluate what works and what doesn't work. And we could just say, do the virtue signaling game. Or we could actually try to figure out what works.
Let me try to explain a little bit, because everybody might not be following the debates about affirmative action as closely. So Peter, he's an economist at Duke. He's confessed to being a Christian believer and to wanting the best for everybody. But why is he saying things like that? Because some of his research has lent credence to the concern that Justice Scalia gave voice to when he asked the question that provoked that cartoon. Namely, some of his research has suggested that under some circumstances, and he can say more about this, it may be the case that the consequence of affirmative action is to lead to a distortion in the way that the students who benefit from affirmative action are allocated to differently ranked institutions of higher education. So there's a matching issue here. The kid has characteristics, the school has characteristics. A good fit is a situation where the characteristics of the kid in the school line up in such a way that the kid prospers at the school. If you put a kid who doesn't have a strong background into a highly demanding academic environment, he may fail, or she. This didn't help the kid, okay? Now, whether that's true or not is an empirical question. It's not something that can be resolved a priori. Peter has been on the front lines and investigating that. Again, he can tell us about it. But sometimes he's found that the answer is the kid is not made better off by being put in the more demanding environment. When he finds that people have been led to react, see there, you're against Black people getting ahead in life. You're trying to kill affirmative action. You don't want social justice. And again, Peter can speak for himself, but I believe he's just saying, whoa, wait a minute. Social justice depends first on understanding the facts. You can't do any kind of justice if you don't know what's actually true about the world. That's all he's trying to do. Did I do a good job defending you, Peter?
Beautiful. And I think, it's really why economics is a dismal science to some extent, right? That fundamentally it rains on the parade of very good intentioned policies by showing, what may actually happen. And I hope that we continue to be the dismal science in that regard and not cave on pursuing the truth.
Do you know Jean Tirol's book, Economics for the Common Good, published by Princeton University Press 3 or 4 years ago?
I know of it, but I haven't read it.
I strongly commend it to your attention. Jean Tirole is a Nobel laureate economic theorist. He's in France now, in Toulouse at the School of Economics there, but for many years was a professor at MIT. He's a very profound thinker on the frontiers of the theory of contracts, incentives, and organization, and so forth in economics. This is Jean Tirole, but he has a book. And I don't mean to take the time away from affirmative action, but I just want people to understand this point. His book is called Economics for the Common Good, and it's a wonderful excursion across a wide range of different policy areas where economics could be applied. But he starts with foundational issues. And one of the issues is, why do people hate economists? Why are economists, called the practitioners of the dismal science? And his point is that often the answers, which are answers about the world, are unpleasant to receive. And economists are the people who deliver them. And so you're blaming the messenger. If I tell you that something costs a lot, and if you pursue it, you will have to give up something else, and you can't have everything that you want, and that's just the way it is, you're going to make me into the bad guy, okay?
Yeah.
So affirmative action is a policy. It's out there. It's got a lot of different aspects to it, and it has a lot of different consequences in different circumstances. And whether or not it's achieving the goals that it is set out to achieve is an empirical question to which the answer will sometimes be no.
Right.
Yeah, so why don't we talk? Yeah, go ahead.
And I think it really depends on how the program is constructed. Because typically, you want your kids to go to a school that's a little bit better than where they're at. So when we think about mismatch, there has to be nuance in that. If we just had an affirmative action program where the bump was small, I don't think there'd be much of a scope for mismatch. It's when things might get much larger, then you have an issue. But even then, my view on this is a lot of that could be resolved if information was provided to the student. Because at the end of the day, as economists, we're sort of rational choice folks. All that affirmative action does is it expands the number of schools that you could potentially attend. So typically expanding the choice set is always a good thing. So to me, the bar for mismatch in a sort of a utility sense is actually incredibly high. But universities could do a lot to resolve the mismatch issue.
Okay, we're going to come back and give people who don't follow it closely a greater specificity about what we mean by mismatch and what the evidence says. But I want to underscore a couple of things. Small bump, less of a problem. This is so very important. Affirmative action is not either or not at all. It is quantitative as well as qualitative. How much you do actually matters. The marginal cost curve rises, and sometimes it rises very steeply. If you set a goal, say with no affirmative action, the Black student presence would be 4%, and you set a goal of 6%, that's one thing. 8%, that's something else. 12%, that's an entirely different world. So the size of the bump matters, and we should be thinking about the cost on the margin. I'm sorry to sound like an economist, but this really is the right way to think about it. You should be thinking about where you want to set the target and what it costs you to make that target a little bit more strenuous. And it may be that targets are set too high at many places, and that much of the problem with affirmative action is a problem with trying to be too intense in the effort rather than doing the effort or not doing it at all. So that was one point that I wanted to make. The other point here, which is really absolutely critical for the mismatch question, is if kids know what the relative alternatives are, they'll sort themselves out so that the ones who would actually be badly hurt by the mismatch will avoid going there in the first place. If they know what they're getting themselves into, they'll make the decision. What am I saying? I'm saying you could go to Yale or Caltech. Caltech doesn't do much affirmative action. Or you could go to the University of Illinois or the University of Indiana. And I'm saying there's nothing wrong with the University of Illinois, and there's nothing wrong with the University of Indiana, but it may be that Yale and Caltech are more demanding for certain kinds of students. And it may be that when those students end up getting admitted under affirmative action, they drop out or don't complete the college career in the way that would be most satisfactory to them. But there could be other students who are Black and who could benefit from affirmative action, who know their own circumstances, and for whom the quote unquote mismatch wouldn't be a mismatch at all. As long as the kids know what they're getting themselves into, they can mitigate whatever the ill effects might have been from a mismatch thing. And I just want to underscore those 2 points because I think they're very important. But do you think Scalia was right to raise that question in the context of that lawsuit in Texas? And what's the answer to his question? Or at least what kinds of answers would you be inclined to give based on your research?
Well, I think the biggest push I want to make for is transparency, because then you can figure out what's a good match and what's not a good match. And to me, this is where, I think these Supreme Court cases have actually worked to the detriment of transparency. So if you think about the twin Michigan cases, you basically said point systems are not allowed. We have to do things holistically. Well, holistically effectively gives you a huge incentive to hide what's going on. And so you'll hear this all the time, race is just a factor of a factor. And same with legacies or athletes, it's always just a factor of a factor. But you never actually find out what that means because they don't release their data. So you don't really know I mean, in principle, you ought to be able to find out how well you fit in with the school. But my view on this is that universities ought to be much more transparent and say, okay, we've accepted you. You said you wanted to do engineering. If you come to this school, given your academic background, here's the probability you'll graduate in engineering in 4 years. Here's the probability you graduate in some other field in 6 years. And then the individual can make an informed decision about what they're doing. They don't want to do that because they'd be worried about the student not showing up, which would be a problem.
Are you confident that you can estimate tightly enough what the probability of a student's completing a program of study is based on their entry-level characteristics, such that they should make their decision based on that advice? What's the standard error around your estimate of that probability?
Well, to give you an example, in one of our papers, we looked at what was going on in the UC system. And if you were in the bottom quartile of applicants to the UC system.
University of California.
Yeah. And you went to Berkeley or UCLA, regardless of your race. You said you want to major in the sciences. The probability you graduated in the sciences in 4 years was 0. So
bottom quartile at the flagship campuses.
Not at the flagship campuses, though. This is among applicants. So typically, if you're a bottom quartile white student, you're not at Berkeley or UCLA.
I see.
But there is a set of minority students who are going to be in that group. There's a few white students who are going to get in through some channel, being in the bottom quartile. But yeah, the gradient is steep on this. I think we talked last time about how at Duke, for Black males, they were switching out at a rate well over 50%, where for white males it was 8%, and that is accounted for by these differences.
We're putting too much weight on STEM here. So what if they switch out? They switch out and they get a degree in sociology. Nothing wrong with that. It's still a degree from Duke or from the University of California, Berkeley.
And there is nothing wrong with that as long as they let them know. So in my view, as long as the schools let them know, these are the probabilities. And so in my view, the mismatch hypothesis disappears if students are informed with what the university knows about their success probabilities. Would totally disappear. Now, I think the other benefit of that is universities ought to be looking at their data to find out what they can do to help people persist.
Yeah.
You know, here we've got, it's amazing. Duke houses the North Carolina education data, which has all the data on high school, secondary, elementary students' test scores.
In the state of North Carolina.
Yeah, for all public schools.
Wow.
And so we're happy to analyze that data. And if you look at, the data for doing that sort of analysis, it's actually a lot more available than it is for colleges, because colleges are nervous. They want to make sure that they're not going to get sued or not going to look bad to the detriment, of the students. I think we could identify very quickly, because the other response says you could just give the information. But the other thing is you could say, look, this person wants to do engineering. We need to help them get ready for that rather than saying, he'll be fine. And when he switches to sociology, we know he's going to switch, but he'll be fine without letting the student know.
Okay, so you're a nice guy and you're not going to say this. Let me say it. There's a certain amount of fraudulence going on here in which both the public and the consumers, in this case, the public are the voter who might vote against or for affirmative action or whatever. And the consumers are the kids who are going to college are being baited and switched. I mean, they're being defrauded. The university is interested in its brand, which is enhanced by its advocacy and its demonstration of diversity. They're less concerned about the consequences of what they do, either for the long-term well-being of the kids or for a kind of honest conversation with society about what's going on. To wit, I give an example. Amy Wax, professor of law at University of Pennsylvania, said on my podcast a couple of years ago that the Black students in her first year law class weren't doing that well, that they tended to lag behind, and she thought it was because of affirmative action. She was excoriated for saying so, but never did anybody tell me what the actual scores of the Black kids were in the class or how much affirmative action was being used in the admissions process. They just blew smoke. They just said, no, nothing to see here. She's a racist. They just blew smoke. How much affirmative action is actually going on? You said that the holistic, this was the Grutter and Gratz cases, the one where Sandra Day O'Connor said, we hope in 25 years we won't have to be doing this. University of Michigan, I don't know, 2003, something like that, landmark affirmative action cases. And they said, no, you can't just give points to the kid because they're Black, but you can have a holistic, you can just kind of, don't have a separate thing where if you're Black, you get in with this or that, but you have a holistic, That's as you say, an invitation to, to what? The personal appeal score? What do you call personality index or whatever it is at Harvard?
Personal rating, yeah.
That is to say, it's an invitation to blow smoke. It's an invitation to obfuscate, to sow confusion, to introduce essentially irrelevant factors into this decision-making process, which you can then manipulate to produce the outcome that you want. So there's a kind of fraudulence here, and you could push this point further if you wanted to. There's a kind of lie that's built into the whole process. But like I say, that's something you would never say because you're too nice a guy.
I'd come close to saying it. But yeah, take that personal rating. You'd like to know, does that predict anything? I guess economists were always about the numbers, and so maybe that's why they would say that's not the point. But it ought to matter for something. Otherwise, why are you doing it?
Okay, well, suppose, again, I should explain. Peter in the Harvard affirmative action case, and he's up against the other side, and the other side say, we're not discriminating against the Asians. And they say, see, they just scored. We have a holistic assessment of the applicant. It's not just their academics, it's also their personality and their athletic skills. The Asians lag behind on personality, but it's a subjective measure what the personality actually is. So the question is, what's the validity of the measure? How would you know? Well, presumably you'd want to track these students over time. You want to see how it correlates with their grades. You want to see also what it means for their later life success and whatnot. And to the extent that the personality measure as assessed by Harvard's admissions process correlated with other objective outcomes that we would value, you might give them a little bit more leeway to make use of it. To the extent that it didn't, you would see it for what it might actually be, which is a screen for being able to discriminate against the Asians.
In favor of legacies, and you can use these ratings to put in whatever preferences that you like. I mean, to me, one of the amazing things was how well white legacies did on the athletic rating. They did better than any other group.
And you taking into account the selectivity, maybe they only apply because the legacies value athletics. Families, I played lacrosse, I rode crew, I was on the sailing team back in my day, back in the 80s, so now my son I want him to, and I'm a legacy, and my kid is, and they start at the age of 10 or in the prep school, they start into these very specialized sports. So it's a kind of,
It's a huge advantage, there was no way I could ever make the soccer team. My kids played on the soccer team because they go to a small private school. That was not going to happen for me going to a public school, but they don't cut anybody at the private school my kids go to.
Now, you mentioned that universities are not all that open with giving out data. Recently, a study has appeared. It was reported in the New York Times out of UC Berkeley, a graduate student out there named Beamer. I think he might be working with CARD. On affirmative action. He had access to voluminous data on matriculants at the University of California's higher education system. I mean, really, really fine data that I understand people like you have been trying to get your hands on for years without success. Comment.
Well, Rick Sander, he's a full professor at Yale's law school, has a lawsuit well before this paper came out.
Sanders at Yale. He used to be at UCLA.
No, he's at UCLA. Yeah.
Okay.
But he has a lawsuit to try to get access to that data.
He's a professor in the University of California system at the law school, and he cannot get his hands on California data about the effects of affirmative action on students in that state. How is that? But other people who are also at the University of California can get their hands on the data? How could that be?
Well, very few people can get their hands on it. I mean, it was amazing that Bleemer was able to get his hands on it.
That's the name of the graduate student at UC Berkeley whose study was reported on in the New York Times, and we can talk more about what he finds, but he basically argues that banning affirmative action with California ballot Proposition 209 ended up adversely affecting African-American students across a broad range of measures. And he takes his findings to be disproving the so-called mismatch hypothesis, because affirmative action actually was helping, on his argument, Black students before it was eliminated in California in 1996. So that's what he finds, but he's got access to these data and a lot of people don't.
A lot of people don't, and this is right before California is going to vote on whether to keep to keep the current system, which does not allow racial preferences in the UC system. They're voting there's a proposition designed to allow racial preferences back in.
I understand.
But there's so much that could have been done in between when that initial proposition, Prop 209, was passed, and now to actually figure out what works, how everything was going. And this is the first sort of paper where somebody's really been given access to that data. It's too bad, because there could have been so much more information about how to improve the system.
Okay, there's a political environment here. I can remember the campaign against affirmative action that led to the passing of ballot Proposition 209 in California in 1996. I remember it vividly. I was, on the scene as an economist, a younger economist, looking at these issues. There was a guy called Ward Connerly. Ward Connerly, a Black man, a businessman who made it his life's work to get rid of affirmative action, and who was the major proponent. There was a lot of conservative money that went into the advertising campaign to persuade voters. And ultimately, Connerly and his colleagues succeeded, and they got affirmative action banned. This was 24 years ago. Now there is a movement to unban the ban, to rescind it, to open it up, and so that I believe it was an amendment by plebiscite to the Constitution of the state, and now this would, in effect, repeal that amendment, and affirmative action would be permitted again. And it's in that context that the young economist Beamer's study arguing that affirmative action the elimination of affirmative action hurt Black students in terms of their later life success. It's in that context that it appears. And it's also in that context that Rick Sander, the law professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, who is a big proponent of the mismatch theory and a big critic of affirmative action, has sued the UC system or the state to release data that he wants to be able to examine, presumably on behalf of his position, which would be to sustain the ban on affirmative action in the state of California.
Well, he actually had that lawsuit well before the Bleemer paper. So he's been asking for that data.
I see, for a long time.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if he would say he would be using it so much to further bans on racial preferences. I think he would say that he wants it so he can look at the research. But that's not going to be the perception by a lot of people, that they're going to perceive it that he's interested in showing the mismatch hypothesis.
Well, but I don't find it implausible to think to project that he would want to argue for the ban. This is not something new. This has been going on for for a quarter century. He was vilified. I remember that law review article in the Stanford Law Review that he published based on the Law School Admissions Council data, where I thought rather convincingly showed at that time, it was the early 1990s. This is a long time ago now. The data was from the early 1990s. The comprehensive data on law school applications of students that go through the Law School Admissions Council portal. And he was showing that there were huge differences in the performance of kids after admission to elite law schools, that there was a huge disparity in the academic preparation and test score performance by race of these students, and that there was a pretty strong correlation between the entry-level characteristics and the performance of students. And moreover, that the effects on post-education career success, like passing the bar examination, were measurable and were in the same direction. So he's been at this for a long time. I mean, so he's dug in. There's no offense from him, no offense whatsoever. You're going to get dug in when you know, and moreover, he's been vilified. He's been, you know, like Scalia in that cartoon, he's been made into a pariah because he's supposed to be a racist because he's raised these questions about affirmative action. So I have no doubt where he would be coming from. And I say that without any disrespect. I mean, he's an advocate. He's also a scholar.
Yeah, and certainly I don't want to be seen as an advocate. I want to be seen as a scholar. And if the results come out one way, I want to say that's how the results come out. And I think on something like the mismatch issue, there are places where mismatch is relevant and places where it's not relevant. And it always, again, depends on how much. So even on Sanders' findings, I don't necessarily see that as meaning we should just get rid of affirmative action. But if we're interested in the pass rate for Blacks on the bar, maybe a little less might be helpful. You know, that would be, you know, how I would take the findings. Yeah, I think a little bit of affirmative action almost has to be helpful from that perspective. Now, there are other reasons why you could be against affirmative action, but not from the mismatch hypothesis perspective.
Well, that's an interesting statement right there. Mismatch is a phenomenon, but its effects are localized, and it depends upon the degree of affirmative action. And a mismatch argument is an argument about calibration, not an argument about whether to abolish or to sustain. Calibrate it so that you don't have these ill effects rather than get rid of it altogether because, you know, it's bad. But here, so we're talking like economists and everything's on the margin and everything is quantitative and whatnot. There are people who are going to say, well, but racial discrimination is wrong. I mean, at the end of your last appearance on the Glenn Show, people, I urge you, if you haven't seen it, to go back and watch part one of this conversation. Peter told a story, and the story was about an Asian applicant who had had a tough life and overcome a lot of obstacles to Harvard, and whose personal essay gave voice to these obstacles, and it was very poignant. And the admissions officer, in effect, had evaluated this applicant's application as standard strong, meaning another Asian kid with high test scores, but nothing to get excited about. And your point was it was anything but standard strong. It was anything but. It was very unstandard. It was something that if you look past somebody being an Asian, a white, or a Black, and you looked at the life of the person, you would be moved by. Now, for somebody like Bloom to come along and say, it's just wrong that kid didn't get a chance to go to Harvard because they were Asian. It's just plain out wrong. I don't care what the numbers are, it's just wrong. They're not interested in costs at the margin. They're making an all or nothing argument about what is the right way for us to conduct ourselves in society. Are you willing to take a position in that argument?
Not a strong one, that's for sure. You know, I think that I can certainly see the arguments. I think one argument in favor of affirmative action is that we need to do things that build trust for a group that has had reasons not to trust the U.S. At the same time, I'm
Like
also
African
sympathetic.
Americans is what you're saying.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. I mean, the history is very bad. You know, I think I've mentioned, my favorite book is The Hiding Place. And The Hiding Place is about these sisters who get thrown into a concentration camp for helping the Jews. And it's a remarkable book because one of them does not survive, but she's a saint. She feels bad for the Nazi guards. She actually prays for the Nazi guards. He loves them anyway. I bring that all up more to say that at the end of the book, after the author gets out of the concentration camp, she runs into one of these Nazi guards who says, "Oh, isn't it great that Jesus forgives?" And she, asks for the grace to forgive him. He's like, "Okay, we're ready to move on." And I think that's, I think that for a lot of people, they might have the view of, we're ready to move on. But the history is such that there's been a broken trust. And so we do need to figure out ways to repair that trust. I'm not sure that affirmative action is the right way to do that. I think, we need to be doing things to invest in communities. We've got to change the relationship between the police and these communities so that trust is rebuilt. If affirmative action, at the margin helps with that, great. But I don't, it's clearly not a panacea, particularly when you get to the mismatch, the case of mismatch, when you go too far.
Okay, so the people who oppose affirmative action in principle, they have their argument, but you're not going to join them there. You think that a certain amount of nuance and sort of openness to compromise is necessary if we're going to build the kind of society that we want, given our history. Am I putting words in your mouth, or am I getting this right? I don't want to.
Well, I'm saying I think it's just so complicated that, I also see the argument that if we're going to move to a society where race is not what defines you in that way, affirmative action is making race more salient. This is fundamentally where we want to acknowledge the mistrust and everything that's happened in the past without it being something that's constantly hanging over your head. I remember my son coming back from school one day and he was just pissed off because they had done a big thing on diversity. And he was my kid who had, more Black friends than any of my other kids. And he was getting along fine with them. But now it's like you're focusing in on what makes us different as opposed to, the common humanity.
I don't see race, I'm colorblind. And the current thinking is very much against that sentiment. It says, in effect, I can't quote chapter and verse from Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, or from who's the woman, Robin DiAngelo, with the white fragility. But roughly the way it goes is that is a luxury that only white people can afford.
Right.
The idea that I don't see race, that's a dodge. It's an effort to avoid the question. Race is so deeply etched into the structures that we inhabit, into our thinking, our subconscious, even, what they call an implicit bias. Race is so historically salient, wealth disparity, the poverty rate differences, segregation, redlining. It's so institutionally etched in, Southern strategy, mass incarceration, et cetera, that this talk about I don't see race, I can't get beyond it. I just want to get beyond it. We should be able to get beyond it. Is something. It's an indulgence. It's a luxury that only the people who have racial privilege already can afford. Okay? It avoids the hard work. How did Kamala Harris put it recently? She says, let's do the work. And this is the Democratic candidate for vice president on the ticket with Biden. In a statement that she made recently, maybe it was during the convention. I think it was during the Democratic National Convention. She said that I was struck by it. Let's do the work. Okay. Yeah. And you can't do the work if you're blind. You got to be able to look at it. This is this kind of idea. Now, I personally think that that's dead wrong. I'm old fashioned. I think even if Martin Luther King was much more sophisticated than some kind of cartoon, I had a dream speech, he was much more subtle. He was a socialist. He was a pacifist. Practically, there was a lot of moral authority going on with King that was not simply captured in that speech. Still, I think he had the right idea, the goal should be transcendence of race. Race is superficial. It's not deep. It's not important. We should be marrying each other in due course, living together across these lines. Black and white should be as important as Irish and Italian is now. It was very important in 1900, Irish and Italian. In 1920, Irish and Italian was very important. In 2020, Irish and Italian is a matter of not that deep. It's not all the way down. I don't know about Greek. Are you a Greek?
Well, I'm actually Italian.
But anyway, you see what I mean? People are
totally.
Yeah. I think that's what we should be going for. And I think we should be trying to get away from thinking about race as the first order of business. I'm even given to saying that when a cop shoots a kid, the first words off of our lips ought not to be white cop shoots black kid. Cops are cops. They need to act right, not wrong, whatever their color. Kids are kids. They don't need to get shot, whatever their color. There's a tragedy when a cop shoots a kid, full stop. You want to make a racial matter out of it? Well, then what happens to when the white supremacist wants to make a racial matter out of criminal rapes woman? Criminal was black, woman was white. That happens sometimes in the United States of America. Yeah. I never want to pick up my newspaper and read black criminal rapes white woman. That's the worst thing in the world. So to me, those are two sides of the same coin.
And I think that
equality depends at some deep level upon affirming color blindness as the right moral standard. I really do, but I can't prove it. It's just my instinct. Thanks for indulging me. I know that was a long speech.
Well, it's interesting you brought up the Irish and Italians because my grandfather committed the cardinal sin. He was Italian, he eloped with an Irish woman. There's a debate about whether she was 14 or 15 at the time, but that was really bad at that time to go off marrying an Irish woman. But to what you said, that doesn't mean we can shoot for that colorblind ideal, but that doesn't mean we don't do anything. So another part of the Harvard case was race-neutral alternatives.
Okay.
And so we're trying to figure out ways of acknowledging the history, but do it in a way where we're not going to be making race as salient in the interaction.
Now, I have to say here, because I have a previous life, and in my previous life, I was very pro-affirmative action. I worked with William Bowen at the Mellon Foundation on some initiatives. I had a little research center at Boston University where I advocated certain things. And one of the things we did, we put in a brief in the Gratz and Grutter cases, University of Michigan cases, saying that colorblind affirmative action was certainly feasible, but it was very inefficient relative to targeted affirmative action, because targeted affirmative action, well, you take the best of the kids in the group that you're trying to advance, and you omit the least performing of the kids in the group that you are not trying to advance. So if I'm not getting enough black kids, I want more black kids. If I can do color-blind, color-sighted affirmative action, if I can actually discriminate by race, I can get the best of the black kids that I otherwise would not have admitted, and I can leave out the least promising of the white kids that I would have otherwise admitted. But if you force me to be colorblind by doing something universally, I'm not going to be able to realize those efficiencies. And if your goal is sufficiently ambitious and you're colorblind, it's very, very inefficient relative to the targeted affirmative action. So I had to say that, otherwise somebody else is going to look me up and say, you forgot what you are. What do you say to that about the efficiency?
Well, I think you're right. It is inefficient from that perspective. And then you end up with, what are the trade-offs? And that's where I think it just gets really hard. I think there are arguments for the affirmative action based on race, like we were talking about, that may take us away from the colorblind, which is our ideal. It's hard.
Well, I have soured on affirmative action as a long-run remedy. I mean, I worry that we're now, this is Glenn Loury, the latter. This is my most recent incarnation. I think it's probably my last one. We're so far down the line. I mean, we've been arguing about this since 1970 for a half century. Yeah. I remember Nathan Glazer's book, Affirmative Discrimination, which was very controversial. And I believe it's published in like 1978 or something like that, around the same time as the Bakke case. When is the Bakke case? Alan Bakke, University of California, Davis Medical School. I think that is the late 1970s.
Yeah.
What does it mean to live in a world in which affirmative action is routinized and made permanent as an institutional practice? To my mind, it means two things. One of them is that Black people can never have real, full, solid equality because we've been now typed permanently as a group that requires special treatment in order to be able to find inclusion in selective venues. And I think that's not equality. So that's one point. Any affirmative action vision over a dynamic period that does not entail it eventually going away cannot produce a steady state of equal standing and dignity between the racial groups. I assert that as a theorem, in effect, because what you're doing is you're basically conceding the condition of African-American underperformance. You can do that for a period of time given history, but you can't do it forever and expect to get equality. That's my proposition. But the other thing that I worry about is devaluation of standards, because if you make permanent using different criteria of admission, and if the criteria of admission correlate with post-admission performance, then you've made permanent a racial disparity in post-admissions performance. But if that's intolerable, the tendency will be to flatten and minimize the differentiations that you're using. For example, the tendency will be to get rid of standardized tests and admissions.
Oh, yeah.
The tendency will be to inflate grades or not do honors or not have other kinds of things if they're going to reflect in racial disparity, something like that. So I don't like the vision for society which relies on affirmative action as a permanent institutionalized practice. I think it's inconsistent with racial equality.
Yeah, and I think even if they did some of the things I suggested on the transparency front, it may actually push them to then change how they're doing their standards so that in a way that we might not like.
You want to flesh that idea out? I mean, be a little bit more concrete. What are you saying?
Well, if you had to tell students, look, given your characteristics, you have no chance of graduating in engineering in 4 years, then maybe you change what you're doing in engineering so that that's not the case.
Meaning we water down the curriculum so that knowing differential equations or whatever is no longer as critical to being able to get an engineering degree, since that's the site where the racial difference would express itself most strongly. The mathematical preparation.
Yeah. But I think that yeah, I mean, I think it really does come down to this transparency issue. And you start on affirmative action in part because universities have done nothing to really look at what helps people succeed at their schools. And, that to me, they have a moral mandate to do so. I'd just like to lay that out there. Any school that wants me to look at their data and help them figure out what would lead to better persistence in STEM fields, I'll sign the confidentiality agreement. So I won't be telling how bad you were doing there. I will do it for free because I want to see the people persist in the sciences. And I think you could fix this quite easily. You could easily identify, look, if you're coming to this school without calculus and you said you want to do engineering, chances are it's not going to work out. Well, let's set something up so that we fix that the summer before you get here. That doesn't have to be race-based. It could be, anyone who's not coming in without calculus before they get here. Universities have scholars. They have the best people to work on that issue of figuring out what would lead to success. And there's no interest.
Let me show another graphic here, which I'd like to get you to react to. This is showing the National Assessment of Educational Progress test scores. It's a little bit dated, 2005. These are 12th grade students, and this is mathematic achievement level. Dark blue means below basic, okay? Yeah. White means advanced, broken down by race. These are high school students. It's a random sample of American high school students in 2005 mathematics proficiency. 70% of African Americans below basic on this national assessment of educational progress, and essentially an insignificant number who are at advanced the test performance on this national exam. And you can see what you can see there for whites, for Asians, for Hispanics, and so on. And the question that I want to ask is, how could you ever expect in demanding technical fields like law and medicine, like engineering, like the sciences, or like economics for that matter, that you have anything close to a proportionate representation by race of students? Now, maybe you can get it at one university because they can recruit and hoard the students, but across the spectrum of university, anything close to proportionate representation, if you don't do something about the basic preparation of students who are feeding into this population. So doesn't this all kind of roll back to
totally.
To K through 12, and
And so that would actually be one of my primary beefs with affirmative action, would be that it's a Band-Aid that's covering up a festering wound, which is the massive inequality that's happened before they get to college. That way we can have our college campus look like the Benetton catalog, but at the end of the day, we haven't addressed the real issues that are happening earlier on. And there is stuff that you could do. The no excuses charters seem to be very successful. There's stuff you could do to really change these gaps.
Have you seen this paper of Roland Fryer's? I think it's in the Journal of Political Economy, on his experiments in Houston, implementing in public schools a no excuses charter type format, curriculum, tutoring, longer school day, longer school year, very selective on the teachers and so forth, high expectations. And he shows like a half standard deviation move in the, he's got random assignment of kids to treatment and control schools. And he shows like a half standard deviation move in the Black kids' test scores over a 2-year period for the treatment group relative to the control group, just by changing the way that the school is organized and run. This is not definitive, but it's certainly suggestive of that interventions well designed in the character of public education could make a big difference in the educational outcomes.
And where do you ever see half standard deviation changes? I mean, that is that is huge.
Just to put it in perspective, the mean difference in test scores on cognitive ability-like tests are typically between Black and white, typically on a matter of 1.0 standard deviation. So this is closing half the racial gap in a 2-year period by changing the school. Don't want to go too far. This is just one piece of data, but it's very suggestive of the potentiality there.
Yeah.
All right, Peter. You got something else you want to say about affirmative action or about life? Because I want to bring us to a close relatively soon.
Yeah, so I just want to make one comment about the nuance associated with affirmative action, because I actually think that the Bleemer paper does show mismatch. And you can see it a bit, he doesn't find any earnings effects for Black students. So basically, you get rid of affirmative action, and the Black earnings didn't change. Hispanic earnings went down. Why is that relevant? Well, affirmative action, at least at the schools I've seen, is typically about twice as aggressive for Hispanic students as it is for Black students. So it's a little bit like a Laffer curve. If you go too far, then you stop seeing the benefits. If you'd had affirmative action for Blacks at the level that it was for Hispanics, then when you get rid of affirmative action, you would have seen Black earnings fall. But they stayed the same. So it effectively, affirmative action is just leading to a wash for Black students. That to me actually illustrates mismatch. If you'd done slightly less aggressive affirmative action, you would have seen Black students having higher earnings as a result of the racial preferences.
And what's the mechanism through which affirmative action is having an effect on the wages of the sort that you just described?
Well, I think that there's a few channels. Part of it is affecting whether you graduate in STEM, even whether, in this case, whether you're working in California, because he only has the wage data if you're in California, and college quality. So, you're going to get a kick for graduating from Berkeley, conditional on graduating and conditional on your major.
Okay. Less aggressive affirmative action would have led to the elimination of affirmative action causing a drop in wages, but in fact it didn't, and that suggests that affirmative action has gone past the point at which it would be optimal.
From an earnings perspective, yes. And this gets back to the point where a little bit has to be helpful. It's just a question of when it gets to be super, super large. I mean, in the Harvard case, my model was showing that by marking Black on your application, you quadrupled your chances of being admitted on average. David Card on the other side showed that it tripled it. Those differences, that's not where the argument is, right? Oh, well, it's okay to do 3.5, but not 4. That's not, we're both showing substantial effects. Where's the right answer? I don't know, but we at least have to know, how much, and then study to see, try to figure out what the optimal amount would be, conditional on having the policies in the first place.
Yeah, something tells me the political debate won't withstand that kind of fine degree of calibration. And if Brown or Yale or anybody were to announce, we're going to admit fewer African-American students next year than we did this year, but the reason why is, and then they were to give the explanation that you just gave, the effects on the margin will on net be beneficial to the students whom we do admit. That would just not fly. People would say that that's an excuse for turning back the clock. So it may be that we're stuck on a glide path here that makes the kind of insight that you bring to the conversation, unfortunately, not all that relevant.
That's right. Though I think hopefully at some point they will at least look at the data, because even if you had the same affirmative action program, you ought to be looking at what leads the students to succeed. And I think pressure should be put on universities. I mean, it drives me nuts to see after the Floyd case, you get these 3-page emails from university administrators talking about systematic racism without ever anywhere in those emails saying, we need to look at the factors that lead students to succeed here. We've got the data. We've got amazing data. All you have to do is put it to use to try to see what would fix the problem. And you might not be able to fix it all the way because of the vast differences in what happens before college. But you can sure do a lot better than not even looking at the data. That's what I would love to come out of this, is that universities, instead of, I mean, back when the protest happened over my paper, what was the conclusion of that? Well, the Black Student Association got some more money for some more diversity events. That didn't solve the problem. And the university never, it's the same thing about with Amy Wax. They never said I was wrong. They said, oh, maybe the data's dated, but they didn't show what the recent.
Just to remind people, he was finding that Black students were dropping out of STEM majors at a vastly higher rate than white students were, but that was because they were being admitted with lower scores in the on the test that showed their aptitude for quantitative work.
Yeah.
You got into trouble for that, but people don't want to.
And the answer to that was this.
Data. Pardon?
And the answer to that, the reason I got in trouble is they're saying I'm saying Black students are inferior. And I went on a radio show where the first person had actually written a whole article on this about how problems with what I had said. And she went first, and as she's talking, my blood's boiling. But really, by grace, I said, if that's what I thought the paper was saying, I'd be upset too. Because fundamentally, we're on the same page. We want Black students to succeed at whatever university they're at. But if I show you that that's not happening, we need to fix this. I'm not saying, they can't succeed. I'm saying that they're not succeeding. And so we need to do something to change that. And that necessitates, at least from a professor's perspective, looking at the data.
Yeah. Well, okay, we covered this ground, and I think we covered it very well. I want to thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate it.
I'm really very excited that we should tell people about the Journal of Economic Literature, the paper with Lovenheim. It's called The Quality Fit Trade-Off. And it is a comprehensive assessment of the empirical literature on the questions that we have been talking about here in terms of how affirmative action plays out in matching kids to colleges and promoting their success or not doing so. So people who are interested can find it without any difficulty. Journal of Economic Literature, Peter Arcidiacono. Thanks for coming on the Glenn Show, Peter.
Thanks for having me, Glenn.
You're welcome.